Literature Whiz presents
Of Mice and Men, by John Steinbeck. Analysis. Section 1. The clearing into which Lenny and George wander evokes Eden in its serenity and beauty. Steinbeck wisely opens the novella with this idyllic scene, for it creates a background for the idealized friendship between the men and introduces the romanticized dream of farm life that they share. The opening pages establish a sense of purity and perfection that the world, which will prove to be cruel and predatory, cannot sustain. Steinbeck also solidly establishes the relationship between George and Lenny within the first few pages of dialogue. Their speech is that of uneducated laborers, but is emotionally rich and often lyrical. Because George and Lenny are not particularly dynamic characters, neither of them changes significantly during the course of the narrative. The impression the reader gets from these early pages persists throughout the novella. Lenny's and George's behavior is relatively static. Lenny's sweet innocence, the undying devotion he shows George, and his habit of petting soft things are his major defining traits from the opening pages to the final scene. Just as constant are George's blustery rants about how much easier life would be without the burden of caring for Lenny, and unconvincing speeches that always end by revealing his love for and desire to protect his friend. Some critics of the work consider George, and especially Lenny, somewhat flat representations of purity, goodness, and fraternal devotion, rather than convincing portraits of complex, conflicted human beings. They charge Steinbeck with being excessively sentimental in his portrayal of his protagonists, his romanticization of male friendship, and in the deterministic plot that seems designed to destroy this friendship. Others, however, contend that any exaggeration in Of Mice and Men, like in so many of Steinbeck's other works, is meant to comment on the plight of the downtrodden, to make the reader sympathize with people whose society and storytellers often deem unworthy because of their class, physical or mental capabilities, or the color of their skin. Whether or not these issues constitute a flaw in the novella, it is true that Steinbeck places George, Lenny, and their relationship on a rather high pedestal. Nowhere is this more clear than in the story George constantly tells about the farm they one day plan to own. This piece of land represents a world in which the two men can live together just as they are, without dangers and without apologies. No longer will they be run out of towns like weed or be subject to the demeaning and back-breaking will of others. As the novella progresses and their situation worsens, George and Lenny's desire to attain the farm they dream about grows more desperate. Their vision becomes so powerful that it will eventually attract other men, who will beg to be a part of it. George's story of the farm, as well as George and Lenny's mutual devotion, lays the groundwork for one of the book's dominant themes, the idealized sense of friendship among men. True to the nature of tragedy, Steinbeck makes the vision of the farm so beautiful and the fraternal bond between George and Lenny so strong in order to place his protagonists at a considerable height from which to fall. From the very beginning, Steinbeck heavily foreshadows the doom that awaits the men. The clearing into which the two travelers stumble may resemble Eden, but it is, in fact, a world with dangers lurking at every turn. The rabbits that sit like gray, sculptured stones hurry for cover at the sound of footsteps, hinting at the predatory world that will finally destroy Lenny and George's dream. The dead mouse in Lenny's pocket serves as a potent symbol of the end that awaits weak, unsuspecting creatures. After all, despite Lenny's great physical size and strength, his childlikeness renders him as helpless as a mouse. Steinbeck's repeated comparisons between Lenny and animals, bears, horses, terriers, reinforce the impending sense of doom. Animals in the story, from field mice to Candy's dog to Lenny's puppy, all die untimely deaths. The book's tragic course of action seems even more inevitable when one considers Lenny's troublesome behavior that got George and Lenny chased out of weed, and George's anticipatory insistence that they designate a meeting place should any problems arise. Section 2. Once George and Lenny arrive at the bunkhouse, the difficulties of the lives they lead become starkly apparent. There are few comforts in their quarters. The men sleep on rough burlap mattresses and do not own anything that cannot fit into an apple box. George's fear that lice and roaches infest his bunk furthers the image of the struggles of such a life. This section also immediately and painfully establishes the cruel, predatory nature of the world. Carlson's belief that Candy should replace his old dog with a healthy newborn puppy signals a world in which the lives of the weak and debilitated are considered unworthy of protection or preservation. The ranch hand's world has limited resources, and only the strongest will survive. As Slim, who voluntarily drowns 4 of his dog's 9 puppies, makes clear, there is little room or tolerance for the weak, especially when resources are limited. Throughout the course of the work, nearly all of the characters will confront this grim reality. Not only does the ranch represent a society that does not consider the welfare of its weaker members, but it also stands as one in which those who hold power wield it irresponsibly. Though the boss seems fair-minded, treating his men to whiskey at Christmas and giving Lenny and George the benefit of the doubt, he is an unimportant character. Instead, his son Curly embodies authority on the ranch. In the book's vision of the world, Curly represents the vicious and belligerent way in which social power tends to manifest itself. Given Curly's temperament, he serves as a natural foil, a character whose emotions or actions contrast with those of other characters, for both the gentle Lenny and the self-assured Slim. Whereas Curly is plagued by self-doubts that cause him to explode violently, Slim possesses a quiet competence that earns him the respect of everyone on the ranch. Like Curly, Slim stands as an authority figure. The men on the ranch look to him for advice, and, later, even Curly will deliver an uncharacteristic apology after wrongly accusing Slim of fooling around with his wife. Slim's authority comes from his self-possession. He needs neither the approval nor the failure of others to confirm his stature. Curly's strength, on the other hand, depends upon his ability to dominate and defeat those weaker than him. George and Lenny immediately feel the threat that Curly's presence poses. To avoid getting into trouble with Curly, they promise to stick even closer to each other than usual. Their friendship is rare and impressive. Slim, who wonders why more men don't travel around together and theorizes that maybe it's because everyone is scared of everyone else, appreciates the closeness of their friendship. In the novella as a whole, Steinbeck celebrates and romanticizes the bonds between men. The men of Mice and Men dominate the ranch and long, more than anything else, to live peaceful, untroubled lives in the company of other men. The only female character who has an active role in the book is Curly's wife, who, significantly, Steinbeck never names, and identifies only in reference to her husband. Other female characters are mentioned in passing, but with the exception of the maternal Aunt Clara, who cared for Lenny before her death, they are invariably prostitutes or troublemakers. Even with all of its concern for treating with dignity the lives of the socially disempowered, Of Mice and Men derogatorily assigns women only 2 lowly functions: caretakers of men, and sex objects. The novel altogether dismisses women from its vision of paradise, regardless of their place in the real world. George and Lenny imagine themselves alone, without wives or women to complicate their vision of tending the land and raising rabbits. Female sexuality is ultimately described as a trap laid to ensnare and ruin men. Section 3. During George's conversation with Slim, Steinbeck establishes the origins of Lenny and George's relationship in a few broad strokes. Theirs is a childhood relationship grown into a rare adult companionship. After years of torturing and taking advantage of his friend, George had a moral awakening, realizing that it is wrong to make a weaker living being suffer for sport. This conviction runs counter to the cruel nature of the world of the ranch hands, in which the strong hunt down and do away with the weak. In this section, the death of Candy's dog testifies to the pitiless process by which the strong attack and eliminate the weak. Candy's dog, although no longer useful at corralling sheep, is of great importance to the old swamper. Candy's emotional attachment to the dog is clear. Regardless, allowing the animal to live out its days is not an option in this cruel environment. Carlson insists that the animal's infirmity makes it unworthy of such devotion. The most comfort he can offer is to assure Candy that he will kill the dog mercifully and quickly. When Slim, the story's most trusted source of wisdom, agrees, he only confirms that their world is one that offers the weak and disempowered little hope of protection. Nearly all of the characters in Of Mice and Men are disempowered in some way. Whether because of a physical or intellectual handicap, age, class, race, or gender, almost everyone finds him or herself outside the structures of social power, and each suffers greatly as a result. Inflexible rules dictate that old men are sent away from the ranch when they are no longer useful, and black workers are refused entrance to the bunkhouse. While the world described in the book offers no protection for the suffering, there are small comforts. Lenny and George's story is one such reprieve. The power of their vision of a simple life on an idyllic little farm rests in its ability to soothe the afflicted. In the opening chapter, this vision acts like a salve for Lenny and George after their tumultuous departure from Weed. Now, it rouses Candy out of mourning for his dog. As soon as the lonely old man overhears George and Lenny discussing their plans, he seems pitifully eager to join in this paradise. Talking about it again also manages to calm and comfort Lenny after his upsetting run-in with Curly. Despite the fact that with Candy's help the possibility of purchasing the farm grows more real for George and Lenny than ever before, it is clear that tragic events will intervene. George's story will prove to be only a temporary escape from the world's troubles, not a cure. Steinbeck advances the narrative toward the inevitable tragedy through many instances of foreshadowing in this section. The story of Lenny's behavior in Weed and his performance in the fight with Curly establish his tendency to exert great strength when confused and frightened. Combined with George's earlier observation that Lenny kept accidentally killing mice while petting them, these events heavily anticipate Lenny's deadly interaction with Curly's wife in the book's climactic scene. Furthermore, the method by which Carlson kills Candy's dog, with a painless shot to the back of the head, sadly mirrors the way George will choose to murder his dearest friend. It is no coincidence that soon after George confides in Slim that he has known Lenny since childhood, Candy pathetically says that he could never kill his dog, since he has had him since he was a pup. Most significant is Candy's quiet comment to George that he wishes he had shot his old dog himself and not allowed a stranger to do it, a distinct foreshadowing of the decision George will make to kill Lenny himself rather than let him be killed by Curly and the others. Section 4. This section introduces the character of Crooks, who has previously only made a brief appearance. Like the other men in the novella, Crooks is a lonely figure. Like Candy, a physical disability sets him apart from the other workers, and makes him worry that he will soon wear out his usefulness on the ranch. Crooks's isolation is compounded by the fact that, as a black man, he is relegated to sleep in a room in the stables. He is not allowed in the white ranch hands' quarters and not invited to play cards or visit brothels with them. He feels this isolation keenly and has an understandably bitter reaction to it. The character of Crooks is an authorial achievement on several levels. First, Crooks broadens the social significance of the story by offering race as another context by which to understand Steinbeck's central thesis. The reader has already witnessed how the world conspires to crush men who are debilitated by physical or mental infirmities. With Crooks, the same unjust, predatory rules hold true for people based on the color of their skin. Crooks's race is the only weapon Curly's wife needs to render him completely powerless. When she suggests that she could have him lynched, he can mount no defense. The second point to note about Crooks's character is that he is less of an easily categorized type than the characters that surround him. Lenny might be a bit too innocent and Curly a bit too antagonistic for the reader to believe in them as real, complex human beings. Crooks, on the other hand, exhibits an ambivalence that makes him one of the more complicated and believably human characters in the novella. He is able to condemn Lenny's talk of the farm as foolishness, but becomes seduced by it nonetheless. Furthermore, bitter as he is about his exclusion from the other men, Crooks feels grateful for Lenny's company. When Candy, too, enters Crooks's room, it is difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. Yet, as much as he craves companionship, he cannot help himself from lashing out at Lenny with unkind suggestions that George has been hurt and will not return. Crooks's behavior serves to further the reader's understanding of the predatory nature of the ranch hand's world. Not only will the strong attack the weak, but the weak will attack the weaker. Crooks, Lenny, and even Curly's wife might have formed an alliance, wherein the various attributes for which society punishes them, being black, being intellectually disabled, and being female, would bring them together. On the ranch, however, they are pitted against one another. Crooks berates Lenny until Lenny threatens to do him physical harm. Crooks accuses Curly's wife of being a tramp, and she, in turn, threatens to have him lynched. As she stands in the doorway to Crooks's room looking over at the men, she draws attention to their weaknesses, laying bare the perceptions by which they are ostracized by society. Like crooks, Curly's wife displays a heartbreaking vulnerability in this scene, readily and shamelessly confessing her loneliness and her unhappy marriage. But because she is as pathetic as the men who sit before her, she seeks out the sources of their weakness and attacks them. Section 5. The scene in the barn begins ominously, with Lenny holding his puppy, now dead, and stroking it in the same way he stroked the dead mouse at the beginning of the work. All sense of optimism for the farm or the freedom the men would have on it dissolves now that Lenny's unwittingly dangerous nature has reasserted itself. When Curly's wife appears and insists on talking with Lenny, the reader senses that something tragic is about to ensue. Perhaps the most significant development in this chapter is Steinbeck's depiction of Curly's wife. Before this episode, the reader might dismiss her as easily as George does. She shows herself to be a flirt, a conscious temptress, and a manipulator. However, in the final moments before her death, Steinbeck presents his sole female character sympathetically. Her loneliness becomes the focus of this scene, as she admits that she too has an idea of paradise that circumstances have denied her. Her dream of being a movie star is not unlike George's fantasy of the farm. Both are desperately held views of the way life should be, which have long persisted despite their conflict with reality. Curly's wife seems to sense, like Crooks, who notes earlier that Lenny is a good man to talk to, that because Lenny doesn't understand things, a person can say almost anything to him. She confesses her unhappiness in her marriage, her lonely life, and her broken dreams in a passion of communication. Unfortunately, she fails to see the danger in Lenny. In her attempt to console him for the loss of his puppy by letting him stroke her hair leads to her tragic death. One might take issue with Steinbeck's description of her corpse, for only in her death does he grant her any semblance of virtue. Once she lies lifeless on the hay, Steinbeck writes that all the marks of an unhappy life have disappeared from her face, leaving her looking pretty and simple, sweet and young. The story has spent considerable time maligning women, and much has been made of their troublesome and seductive natures. It is disturbing, then, that Steinbeck seems to subtly imply that the only way for a woman to overcome that nature and restore her lost innocence is through death. Lenny's flight from the barn shifts the focus of the narrative to George. As George realizes what Lenny has done, the painful mission that he must undertake becomes clear to him. Here, as in the earlier scene with Candy's dog, Slim becomes the voice of reason, pointing out that the best option for Lenny now is for him to be killed. George understands that he has a choice: either he can watch his friend be murdered by Curly's lynch mob or he can do the deed himself. With this realization, the idea of the farm and the good life it represents disappears. Candy clings to that idealized hope, asking George if they can still buy the farm, but George's response is among the most insightful and realistic responses in the novella. There's no room for dreaming in such a difficult and inhospitable world. Section 6. Once again, the scene opens on the clearing in the woods, with the riverbed and its surroundings described as beautiful and idyllic toward the end of a day. Many details are repeated from the book's opening passages, such as the quality of the sunlight, the distant mountains, and the water snakes with their heads like periscopes. This time, however, even the natural beauty is marred by the suffering of innocence. Steinbeck vividly describes a large heron bending to snatch an unsuspecting snake out of the water, then waiting as another swims in its direction. Death comes quickly, surely, into the unaware. When Lenny appears, the fate that awaits him is obvious. The final scene between George and Lenny is suffused with sadness, even though Lenny retains his blissful ignorance until the end. To reassure Lenny, George forces himself through their habitual interaction one last time. He claims that he is angry, then assures him that all is forgiven and recites the story of their farm. For George, this final description of life with Lenny, of the farm and the changes it would have brought about, is a surrender of his dreams. The vision of the farm recedes, and George realizes that all of his talk and plans have amounted to nothing. He is exactly the kind of man he tried to convince himself he was not, just one among a legion of migrant workers who will never be able to afford more than the occasional prostitute and shot of liquor. Without Lenny, George relinquishes his hope for a different life. Lenny was the only thing that distinguished his life from the lives of other men and gave him a special sense of purpose. With Lenny gone, these hopes cannot be sustained. The grim note on which the story closes suggests that dreams have no place in a world filled with such injustice and adversity. The other men who come on the scene see only the body of someone who killed a woman and deserved to die. Only Slim, the wisest and most content man on the ranch, understands George's profound loss and knows that George needs to be consoled. Carlson and Curly watch Slim lead George away from the riverbank. Their complete puzzlement is rooted more in ignorance than in heartlessness. Carlson and Curly represent the harsh conditions of a distinctly real world, a world in which the weak will always be vanquished by the strong and in which the rare, delicate bond between friends is not appropriately mourned because it is not understood. Thank you for watching. If you want the videos to continue, all you have to do is like and subscribe. You can share the books you want with us as comments. May the magic be with you.